She was left at the altar until the Duke stepped from the crowd. Hello readers, welcome to this channel. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also, share this video with your loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you. As you do so, sit back and relax as we dive into this story. 1. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Margaret's Church, casting colored patterns across the white runner that stretched between rows of packed pews. Clara Trent stood at the altar in her ivory gown, her veil trembling slightly with each shallow breath she took. The lace bodice felt too tight suddenly, or perhaps it was just her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at Nathan row beside her. The vicar's voice droned on, steady and formal, speaking words Clara had heard at a dozen weddings before her own. Words about love and commitment, about joining two lives together before God and witnesses. She had imagined this moment so many times over the past year, pictured Nathan's face breaking into that charming smile as he said his vows, felt the relief of finally belonging somewhere permanent after years of uncertainty. But Nathan wasn't smiling. His jaw was clenched tight, a muscle jumping beneath his clean-shaven cheek. His hands, which should have been warm and reassuring in hers, felt cold and stiff. Clara's stomach twisted with a fear she couldn't name, couldn't voice, not here, not now, not with 200 guests watching their every move. Nathan Rowe, the vicar, intoned, his voice carrying through the hushed church. Wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep thee only unto her, so long as ye both shall live? The silence that followed stretched like taffy, pulling thinner and thinner until Clara thought it might snap. She could hear someone shift in the pews behind her, the rustle of fabric impossibly loud. A child whispered something, the sound carrying in the weighted quiet. Clara's eyes stayed fixed on Nathan's face, watching the color drain from his features, watching something like panic flash across his expression. Nathan, the vicar, prompted gently, confusion creeping into his tone. Nathan's throat worked as he swallowed. His eyes met Clara's for just a moment, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. It wasn't love or nervousness or even fear. It was resignation mixed with something darker, something that looked almost like resentment. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. I cannot do this. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. Clara felt the heat climb her neck, spreading across her face like wildfire. Her ears rang with a sound that might have been gasps from the congregation or just the rushing of her own blood. The bouquet in her hands suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. Nathan, someone called from the pews, his mother's voice sharp with shock and command. Nathan, what are you doing? But Nathan had already taken a step back, then another. His hands dropped Clara's as if they burned him. The vicar reached out instinctively, mouth opening to say something, anything, but no words came. Clara couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stand there in her white dress while the man she had agreed to marry turned his back on her. The sound of Nathan's footsteps echoed through the church as he walked down the aisle. Not running, but walking with determined purpose, pushing past guests who half rose from their seats in confusion. Someone tried to grab his arm, but he shook them off. The heavy church doors groaned open, then slammed shut behind him with a finality that made Clara flinch. The silence that followed was worse than any noise could have been. It pressed down on Clara from all sides, suffocating and complete. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, could sense the shift from shock to pity to something that looked uncomfortably like entertainment on some faces. Her father half stood in the front pew, his face purple with rage or embarrassment or both. Her mother gripped his sleeve hard enough that her knuckles showed white, her expression torn between fury and shame. Clara's vision blurred at the edges. The church seemed to tilt slightly, the floor no longer quite solid beneath her feet. She needed to move, needed to do something, but her body refused to cooperate. She was rooted to the spot, a statue in white lace, a monument to humiliation that everyone had come dressed in their finest to witness. Then, through the thick silence, she heard footsteps. Different from Nathan's hasty retreat, these were measured and calm. A man rose from somewhere in the middle pews, tall and distinguished, moving with the kind of confidence that didn't require rushing. Clara's vision cleared enough to focus on him as he approached. Julian Ashbourne, Duke of Evermere. She had met him only once, briefly, at a dinner Nathan's family had hosted. He was some distant connection to the Rowe family, invited more out of obligation than friendship. He had barely spoken all evening, observing the celebration with dark, thoughtful eyes that seemed to see more than most people wanted to reveal. Now those eyes were fixed on Clara with something that looked like understanding rather than pity. He walked past the frozen vicar, past the abandoned Unity candles and the flowers that suddenly seemed too cheerful for what had just occurred. He stopped beside Clara and offered his arm with a slight bow. "You do not have to stand here alone," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Not a rescue, not a grand gesture, just a simple acknowledgement that she had choices even now. Clara looked at his offered arm, then at his face. There was no judgment there, no curiosity, just solid steadiness that felt like the only real thing in a room that had become surreal and nightmarish. Her hand moved before her mind fully decided, reaching out to rest on his sleeve. His arm was solid and warm beneath the fine fabric of his coat. Together, they turned and walked back down the aisle. Every step felt like walking through water, heavy and slow. Clara kept her chin up through sheer force of will, even as tears burned behind her eyes. The guests on either side of the runner watched them pass with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to barely concealed delight at having witnessed such a scandal. Someone whispered behind a gloved hand. A woman made a small sound of pity that somehow felt worse than outright mockery. A child asked loudly why the bride was leaving with a different man and was quickly shushed by a mortified parent. Julian's pace never wavered. He guided Clara steadily toward the doors at the back of the church, his presence beside her the only thing keeping her from collapsing entirely. When they reached the doors, he pushed them open himself, and the cool autumn air hit Clara's face like a slap, shocking her back into her body. The church courtyard was empty, mercifully free of witnesses. Clara's legs finally gave out, and she sagged against the stone wall beside the door. Julian stayed close but didn't touch her, giving her space to breathe, to process, to simply exist in the awful reality of what had just happened. "I am sorry," he said after a moment, his voice carrying genuine regret. "That was brutal, and you did not deserve it." Clara laughed, a sound with no humor in it whatsoever. "No," she agreed, her voice breaking. "I did not." Behind them, the church doors opened again as guests began to file out, their voices a rising tide of speculation and gossip. Julian glanced at them, then back at Clara with a slight frown. "My carriage is at the side entrance," he offered. "If you wish to avoid that particular gauntlet, I can take you and your parents home." Clara looked at the growing crowd, at the faces turned toward her with avid curiosity, and nodded. She didn't trust her voice enough to speak. Julian offered his arm again, and this time she took it without hesitation, letting him guide her away from the whispers and the stares, away from the church where she was supposed to have gotten married, away from the future she had planned that had just crumbled into dust. 2. The small drawing room at the Trent house felt suffocating despite its generous windows. Clara sat in a high-backed chair, still wearing her wedding dress, though someone had removed her veil and the pins from her hair. Her mother's handiwork, probably, during those first awful minutes after they had arrived home. The elaborate updo she had spent hours perfecting that morning now hung in loose waves around her face, making her look younger and more vulnerable than she wanted to feel. Julian stood near the window at a respectful distance, having declined the offer to sit. He seemed to understand instinctively that Clara needed space more than company, but he also hadn't left despite her parents' multiple assurances that they could handle things from here. Clara found his steady presence oddly comforting, a fixed point in a world that had tilted sideways. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, though now they felt numb and disconnected from her body. The bouquet lay abandoned on a side table, white roses already beginning to wilt in the warm afternoon air. Someone had thought to bring it from the church, though Clara couldn't imagine why. What was she supposed to do with flowers meant for a wedding that never happened? The door burst open without warning, and Clara's parents swept in like a storm, making landfall. Her mother, Margaret Trent, still wore her formal gown, though she had pulled off her hat somewhere along the way. Her father, Richard, had loosened his collar, his face still flushed with the anger that had been building since they left the church. "Well," Margaret said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "That was a disaster. An absolute disaster. The entire town was there, Richard. Everyone we know watched our daughter get abandoned at the altar like some common." "Margaret," Richard interrupted, glancing at Clara with something that might have been concern beneath his fury. "Perhaps this conversation can wait." "Wait." Margaret's voice climbed higher. "Wait for what? For the gossip to spread even further? For people to start asking what Clara did to drive that boy away?" Clara flinched at the words, even though part of her had been thinking the same thing. What'd she done wrong? What had she missed in Nathan's behavior that should have warned her this was coming? "Mrs. Trent." Julian spoke up from his position by the window, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "I understand you are upset, but placing blame on your daughter for Nathan's cowardice seems both unfair and unproductive." Margaret turned to look at him as if she had forgotten he was there. Her expression shifted, probably remembering that dukes did not typically involve themselves in the domestic affairs of country families, and that his continued presence suggested either remarkable kindness or troubling interest. "Your Grace," she said, her tone forcibly moderated. "Of course you are right. We are all simply shocked and trying to make sense of what happened." "What happened," Julian said evenly, "is that Nathan Rowe proved himself unworthy of your daughter in the most public way possible. That is entirely his failing, not hers." Richard moved to the drinks cabinet and poured himself a generous measure of brandy, not offering any to the others. "The question now is what we do about it," he said heavily. "There will be talk. Already is talk, if the way people were clustering in the churchyard is any indication." "Let them talk," Clara said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. All eyes turned to her. "What else can we do? We cannot stop people from gossiping. We cannot change what happened. We could try to salvage something from this mess," Margaret said, sitting down abruptly on the sofa as if her legs had given out. "Perhaps if you wrote to Nathan, apologized for whatever disagreement you might have had." "No." Clara's voice came out harder than she intended. "I will not apologize for being left at the altar. I did nothing wrong, and I will not grovel to a man who humiliated me in front of everyone I know." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but Richard held up a hand. "Clara is right," he said quietly. "Nathan made his choice, and it cannot be unmade. We must focus on the practical matters now." "The practical matters." Clara almost laughed at the euphemism. He meant managing the scandal, protecting the family reputation, finding ways to show their faces in society again without being objects of pity or mockery. "There's also the matter of Clara's employment," Richard continued, not meeting his daughter's eyes. Or rather, the lack of it. Clara's stomach dropped. In the chaos of the morning, she had forgotten about the letter she had written 2 weeks ago to Mr. Pemberton at the school office, politely resigning from her position as junior clerk. She had been so certain that marriage to Nathan meant she would no longer need to work, that his income would be more than sufficient to support them both. Now she had no job, no husband, and no immediate prospects for either. "The position has already been filled," Richard said, confirming Clara's worst fear. "I inquired this morning before the ceremony. They hired young Thomas Fletcher to replace you." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of a carriage passing outside. Clara felt the walls closing in, felt the full weight of her situation settling onto her shoulders. No job, no income of her own, and soon, no doubt, no invitations to the social events where marriages were often made. Who would want to associate with a woman left at the altar? Who would risk their son or brother on someone who had apparently been found so wanting? "If I may," Julian said carefully, drawing everyone's attention again. "I came here today with a specific purpose beyond ensuring Miss Trent arrived home safely." Clara looked up at him, confused. He met her gaze directly, his dark eyes serious but not pitying. My estate, Evermere, has a charity school that has been poorly managed for several years, he explained. The records are a mess, the attendance tracking is nearly non-existent, and the tenants' accounts are in similar disarray. I need someone with organizational skills, someone patient with both numbers and people, to help put everything in order. He paused, glancing at Clara's parents before continuing. I understand Miss Trent has experience with clerical work and office management from her position at the school. Having seen her composure under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, I believe she would be well suited to the position I am offering. Clara's heart began to beat faster, but not with a panicked rhythm from the church. This was something different, a flutter of possibility in the midst of disaster. You are offering me employment? If you're interested, Julian said. The position would be paid, naturally, and would involve traveling to Evermere several days each week. You would have full authority over the school records and would work directly with the families in the village to address their concerns and questions. Your Grace, Margaret said slowly, clearly trying to work out the implications. While we appreciate your generosity, surely you understand how it might look for Clara to take employment with you so immediately after today's events. Julian turned to face her fully. I understand your concern, Mrs. Trent. But I'm offering your daughter honest work that will pay her a fair wage and give her something productive to focus on during what I imagine will be a difficult time. I am not offering charity or asking anything inappropriate in return. People will still talk, Margaret insisted. They will say Clara planned this somehow, that she caught a duke's attention and deliberately sabotaged her wedding to Nathan. They're going to talk regardless, Julian pointed out reasonably. At least this way, Miss Trent will have income and purpose while they do so. Clara looked at the Duke, really looked at him for the first time since he had offered his arm at the church. He was perhaps 10 years older than her, with dark hair just beginning to show silver at the temples and strong features that stopped short of handsome but suggested intelligence and character. His clothes were well made, but not ostentatious, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his worth to anyone. More importantly, he was offering her a lifeline when she desperately needed one. The question was whether she could afford to take it, both literally and socially. I need to think about this, Clara said finally. It is a generous offer, Your Grace, but you must understand it is also complicated given the circumstances. Julian nodded as if he had expected this response. Of course. Take whatever time you need. I will be in town for another few days if you wish to discuss the details further. After he left, Clara's parents immediately began arguing about the wisdom of accepting his offer. Her mother worried about appearances and reputation, about what people would say if Clara went to work for the Duke who had escorted her from her failed wedding. Her father worried more about money and practicality, pointing out that they could not afford to support Clara indefinitely without her own income. Clara listened to them talk around her rather than to her, and slowly felt something hard and determined settle in her chest. She thought about Nathan walking away without a backward glance, about the whispers that would follow her anyway regardless of what she did, about the fact that she needed work and Julian Ashbourne was offering exactly that. I'm going to accept, she announced, cutting through her parents' debate. They both turned to stare at her. I need employment, and His Grace is offering me a position I am qualified for. If people want to invent scandal where there is none, that is their failing, not mine. Clara, her mother began. No, Clara said firmly. I will not hide in this house and hope the gossip dies down. I will not beg Nathan to take me back. I will not spend the next year being pitted by everyone I meet. I will work, and I will prove that being left at the altar does not define the rest of my life. She stood up from the chair, her wedding dress rustling around her like ghost of what should have been. Now, if you will excuse me, I'm going to change out of this dress and burn in the garden. Neither of her parents tried to stop her as she walked from the room, her head high despite the tears that finally began to slip down her cheeks. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding that wasn't, and Clara found herself settled into a routine that would have been unimaginable on that awful morning at the church. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, she traveled the 8 miles to Evermere in the carriage Julian sent for her. She worked in a small office adjacent to the main house, surrounded by ledgers and record books that had been neglected for far too long. The work itself was satisfying in ways Clara hadn't expected. There was something deeply calming about bringing order to chaos, about transforming columns of confused numbers into clear accounts that made sense. The charity school served about 40 children from the tenant families in nearby village, but the attendance records were so poorly kept that it was nearly impossible to tell which students were regularly absent and which families might need additional support. Clara had started by creating a new system entirely. She designed attendance sheets that were simple enough for the schoolmaster to maintain, then worked backward through the old records to establish patterns. Within 2 weeks, she had identified 3 families whose children had stopped attending entirely, and had visited each household personally to understand why. The first family needed books and supplies they couldn't afford. The second had a sick grandmother who required care during school hours. The third simply hadn't understood that the school was free for tenant children. Clara had been able to address all 3 situations, and within days, those children were back in their classes. You have accomplished more in 3 weeks than the previous administrator did in 3 years, Julian remarked one afternoon as they reviewed her progress over tea in the estate's library. It had become their habit to meet late in the day to discuss any issues that had arisen, though lately their conversations had drifted beyond purely professional matters. The previous administrator was more interested in collecting his salary than doing the actual work, Clara replied, selecting a biscuit from the tray between them. The bar was not particularly high. Julian smiled, a rare expression that softened his usually serious features. Still, you should be proud of what you have built here. The families are noticing. I have had several tenants mention your name specifically when bringing concerns to my attention. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at the praise, but also a flicker of unease. I hope that does not cause problems. I know some people still find my presence here unusual. Some people will find anything unusual if it gives them something to gossip about, Julian said evenly. But the ones who matter, the families who benefit from your work, they see you for what you are: competent, kind, and genuinely interested in helping. They had fallen into an easy companionship over the past weeks, something Clara valued more than she wanted to admit. Julian treated her as an equal, asking her opinions on matters beyond just the school accounts and actually listening when she offered suggestions. He never made her feel like a charity case or someone to be pitied. Instead, he seemed to genuinely respect her abilities and judgment. Still, the outside world was less understanding. The gossip in town had evolved as Clara had feared it would. At first, people had whispered about what Clara must have done to drive Nathan away. Then, when word spread that she was working for the Duke of Evermere, the rumors shifted. Now some claimed she had been carrying on with Julian all along, that she had deliberately sabotaged her wedding to pursue a better match. Clara had learned to ignore most of it, but one incident the previous week had cut particularly deep. She had been in the market buying supplies for the school when she overheard 2 women talking near the vegetable stalls. Working for a duke, one had said with a knowing sniff. We all know what that means. She probably threw herself at him the moment Nathan had the sense to leave her. I heard she was unfaithful, the other had added. That is why Nathan called it off. He discovered her true nature just in time. Clara had stood frozen behind a display of apples, fighting the urge to confront them and knowing it would only make things worse. Instead, she had finished her shopping with trembling hands and left as quickly as possible. But something had shifted in her that day. She realized she could spend the rest of her life trying to control what people said about her, or she could simply live her life and let her actions speak for themselves. The choice seemed obvious, even if executing it was harder than it sounded. Now, sitting in Julian's library with afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows, Clara felt more herself than she had in months. Perhaps more than she ever had, even before the disaster at the church. May I ask you something personal? Julian said, setting down his teacup. His tone suggested he had been considering the question for some time. Clara nodded, curious. Of course. Do you regret accepting my offer to work here? Knowing the talk it has generated, Clara considered the question seriously. No, she said finally. I regret that people are cruel and small-minded. I regret that my life provides them with entertainment. But I do not regret having meaningful work or regret getting to know you in the process. Something flickered in Julian's eyes, an emotion Clara couldn't quite name. Before he could respond, however, Voices echoed in the hallway outside the library. The door opened without warning, and Clara's heart sank as she recognized the face of the man who stepped inside. Nathan Rowe looked much as he had on their wedding day, except perhaps more uncomfortable. His eyes darted around the library before settling on Clara with what might have been guilt or might have been irritation at finding her here. "Miss Trent," he said with a stiff bow. "I was told I might find you here." Julian rose smoothly from his chair, his expression cooling into polite formality. "Mr. Rowe, I was not aware you had business at Evermere." "I do not," Nathan admitted, still looking at Clara. "I came to speak with Miss Trent, if she would grant me a few minutes of her time." Clara's first instinct was to refuse outright. The man had left her standing at the altar in front of 200 people and hadn't said a word to her since. What could he possibly have to say now that would matter? But curiosity won out over anger. She stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that wanted to shake, but didn't. "Very well, we can speak in the garden." Julian started to object, but Clara shook her head slightly. "It is all right. I will not be long." The garden at Evermere was beautiful even in autumn, with late-blooming roses and carefully maintained paths that wound between formal beds. Clara led Nathan to a bench near the fountain, far enough from the house to ensure privacy, but visible enough from the windows that no one could accuse them of impropriety. "What do you want, Nathan?" Clara asked once they were seated, her voice carefully neutral. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she remembered from their courtship. "I wanted to apologize. Properly apologize, not just the cowardly letter I sent last week." Clara hadn't opened the letter, had thrown it directly into the fire instead. "Go on, and I should not have handled things the way I did," Nathan said, the words coming out stilted as if rehearsed. "It was wrong of me to wait until the ceremony to express my doubts. You deserved better than that." "Yes," Clara agreed. "I did." Nathan blinked, clearly having expected more resistance or emotion. "My family has been quite upset about the situation. My mother in particular feels I behaved dishonorably." "Your mother is correct." Another uncomfortable pause. Nathan shifted on the bench, his hands clasped between his knees. "There was pressure, you understand, from my family, from yours, from everyone expecting us to marry. I felt trapped, and I panicked." Clara turned to look at him fully for the first time. "Nathan, did you ever actually want to marry me? Or was I just the convenient choice that everyone approved of?" He had the decency to look ashamed. "I thought I did. I thought it would be enough, that we suited each other well enough, that the approval of our families and shared friends would be sufficient foundation. But it wasn't." "No," he admitted quietly. "And I'm sorry for that, Clara. Truly, you are a good person, and you did not deserve to be humiliated." Clara waited, sensing there was more he hadn't said yet. "My family thinks," Nathan continued, his voice dropping lower, "that perhaps we could still make this work. If we married quietly, without ceremony or fuss, we could put this whole unfortunate incident behind us. People would talk initially, but eventually it would be forgotten." There it was. Not actually an apology at all, but a proposition to save face. Clara almost laughed. "Let me see if I understand correctly," she said, her voice sharp now. "You left me at the altar because you felt trapped. Now, weeks later, you want me to marry you anyway, so that your family can save face and people will stop gossiping about your cowardice?" "That is not," Nathan started. "That is exactly what you are suggesting," Clara interrupted. "And my answer is no, absolutely not." Nathan's expression shifted from guilty to annoyed. "You are being unreasonable. Think about your own reputation, Clara. Working for the Duke of Evermere so soon after our broken engagement? People are already saying terrible things about you. I am aware of what people are saying. Then you must see that marrying me, even now, is your best option for salvaging any kind of future." Clara stood, suddenly unable to bear sitting next to him for another moment. "My best option is to build a life based on my own choices and my own worth, not to chain myself to a man who sees me as a convenient solution to his social problems. You made your choice at the church, Nathan. I'm making mine now." She turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Nathan sitting alone on the bench. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it was with anger rather than fear. How dare he suggest she should still marry him after what he had done? How dare he assume she was so desperate or damaged that she would accept such a hollow offer? When she reached the library, she found Julian standing near the window that overlooked the garden. He had clearly been watching, his expression dark with barely contained anger. "Are you all right?" he asked as she entered. "Yes," Clara said, and realized she meant it. "I'm hurt and angry, but I'm all right." "What did he want?" Clara moved to pour herself more tea, needing something to do with her hands. "He wanted me to marry him quietly to save both our reputations. He seemed to think I should be grateful for the offer." Julian's jaw tightened. The man's arrogance is astounding. "I told him no," Clara said, meeting Julian's eyes. Firmly and finally. "Whatever I thought I felt for Nathan died the moment he walked away from me at that church. I will not resurrect it for the sake of convenience." Something changed in Julian's expression, a softness around his eyes that made Clara's breath catch. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "You deserve far better than a marriage of convenience to a man who does not value you." "And what do I deserve?" Clara asked, surprised by her own boldness. Julian crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You deserve a partner who sees your strength and your intelligence, who values your opinion and respects your choices, who will be proud to stand beside you, not in front of you or behind you, but as an equal." Clara's heart hammered in her chest. "That sounds like a very specific description." "Perhaps it is," Julian said, a small smile touching his lips. "Perhaps I have been thinking about this for some time now, watching you transform the chaos of my estate's records into order, seeing you win over skeptical families with your patience and genuine care. Perhaps I have come to care for you far more than is strictly appropriate for an employer." "Julian," Clara breathed, her hands trembling as she set down her teacup before she dropped it. "I'm not asking anything of you," he said quickly. "Not now, not when you're still healing from what Nathan did. But I wanted you to know that I see you, Clara Trent. I see exactly who you are, and I find that woman remarkable." Before Clara could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway, and a servant knocked at the door to announce that Clara's carriage was ready to take her home. The moment broke, but something fundamental had shifted between them, an understanding that had been acknowledged if not yet fully explored. As Clara gathered her things to leave, Julian caught her hand briefly. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." Clara squeezed his hand in return, unable to find words for the tangle of emotions in her chest, and allowed herself to be led to the waiting carriage. On the ride home, she watched the familiar countryside roll past and thought about the strange trajectory her life had taken. Left at the altar 1 month ago, devastated and humiliated. Now, employed and valued, with the growing realization that what she had felt for Nathan had been a pale shadow compared to what was developing between her and Julian. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since that awful morning at St. Margaret's Church, Clara found herself looking forward to it rather than dreading what came next. 4. The charity event at Evermere had been planned for months, long before Clara had entered Julian's employment or his life. It was an annual gathering that brought together the tenant families, local gentry, and various members of society who supported the estate's charitable endeavors. This year, it would serve an additional purpose, showcasing the improvements made to the school and giving donors a clear accounting of how their contributions were being used. Clara had been instrumental in organizing the event, coordinating with the schoolmaster on a presentation by the students, and preparing detailed financial reports that showed exactly where every pound had gone. The transparency was unusual for such events, where donations were often accepted with vague promises of good works. Julian had insisted that people deserved to see the concrete results of their generosity. Now, as Clara stood in her small room at home the morning of the event, she felt her stomach twist with anxiety. Not about the work she had done or the presentation she would give, but about the people who would be in attendance. Everyone who had witnessed her humiliation at the church would be there. Nathan and his family had been invited as long-standing supporters of Evermere's charitable programs. The same faces that had watched her stand abandoned at the altar would now watch her stand before them again. "You do not have to do this," her mother said from the doorway, startling Clara from her thoughts. Margaret had been surprisingly supportive over the past weeks, perhaps realizing that her daughter's employment at Evermere was the best possible outcome given the circumstances. The Duke would understand if you preferred to remain behind the scenes. I could do that, Clara agreed, adjusting the collar of her dress in the mirror. She had chosen a simple but elegant gown in deep blue, professional without being severe. But hiding would suggest I have something to be ashamed of, and I do not. Margaret studied her daughter with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. You have changed, she said finally, since that day at the church. You are stronger somehow. I had no choice but to become stronger, Clara replied. But yes, I suppose I have changed. I'm no longer willing to make myself small, so others feel comfortable. The carriage ride to Evermere felt longer than usual, Clara's nerves building with each mile. When they finally arrived, the estate ground were already filling with guests. Families from the tenant cottages mixed with well-dressed ladies and gentlemen from town, an unusual mingling of classes that Julian encouraged at these events. Children ran between the adults, their excited voices carrying on the autumn air. Julian found Clara almost immediately, materializing at her side with the timing of someone who had been watching for her arrival. You look lovely, he said quietly, offering his arm. Are you ready? As ready as I can be, Clara admitted, taking his arm and drawing strength from the solid warmth of him beside her. The first hour passed in a blur of greetings and small talk. Clara was introduced to donors she hadn't met before, explained the new record-keeping system to curious inquiries, and accepted compliments on the obvious improvements to the school's organization. Several tenant families sought her out specifically to thank her for her help with their children's education. Then Clara saw Nathan. He stood with his mother near the refreshment table, both dressed in their finest, looking uncomfortable and out of place among the genuine warmth of the gathering. Mrs. Rowe's face was tight with disapproval as she watched Clara circulate through the crowd on Julian's arm. They are watching you, Julian murmured, following her gaze. Let them watch, Clara said, lifting her chin. I have nothing to hide. Shortly before the formal presentation was scheduled to begin, Julian called for everyone's attention. Guests gathered in the open space before the house where a small platform had been erected. Clara's heart pounded as she climbed the steps, acutely aware of every eye on her. Friends and neighbors, Julian began, his voice carrying easily over the assembled crowd. Thank you all for joining us today to celebrate the work being done through Evermere's charitable programs. This year has seen remarkable improvements to our school, both in attendance and in the quality of education we are able to provide. Much of this progress is due to the tireless efforts of Miss Clara Trent, who has brought organization, compassion, and genuine dedication to our community. He stepped aside, gesturing for Clara to take his place at the front of the platform. For a moment, Clara's legs felt locked in place, memories of standing frozen at the altar threatening to overwhelm her. But this was different. This time, she had chosen to be here. This time she had something real to offer. Clara stepped forward, her hands gripping the notes she had prepared. She looked out at the sea of faces and saw Nathan watching her with an unreadable expression. She saw his mother's pursed lips and disapproving glare. She saw other faces too, people who had witnessed her humiliation and had probably discussed it at length over dinner parties and afternoon teas. But she also saw the tenant families, parents whose children now attended school regularly because Clara had taken the time to understand their challenges. She saw the schoolmaster, who had written her a letter of thanks for making his job possible instead of impossible. She saw Julian standing to the side with quiet confidence in his eyes. Good afternoon, Clara began, her voice wavering slightly before steadying. When I first came to Evermere 3 months ago, the school records were in such disorder that it was nearly impossible to track which students were attending and which had stopped coming. Today, I am pleased to report that we have achieved 97% attendance among enrolled students. She continued through her presentation, detailing the new systems, the intervention programs for struggling families, and the careful accounting of how donations have been spent. With each sentence, her voice grew stronger. The crowd listened attentively, several people nodding in approval as she explained the tangible results of their support. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Then applause began, tentative at first, but growing warmer and more sustained. Clara saw genuine appreciation on many faces, watched as whispers passed between guests that seemed more admiring than critical. Julian returned to the platform, not to rescue her, but to publicly acknowledge what she had accomplished. As you can see, Miss Trent has not simply managed records. She has transformed the way we serve this community. The clarity and accountability she has brought to our programs ensures that every contribution makes a real difference in the lives of these children. He looked directly at Clara as he spoke, and the warmth in his expression made her breath catch. It takes rare courage and dedication to rebuild after disappointment, to choose meaningful work over comfortable retreat. Miss Trent has shown us all what grace under pressure truly looks like. The applause came again, louder this time. Clara descended from the platform, her legs steadier now, and was immediately surrounded by well-wishers. Donors asked questions about expanding the programs. Parents thanked her personally. Even some of the gentry who had been coolest toward her offered grudging respect for her competence. Through it all, Clara noticed Nathan and his mother standing apart from the crowd, isolated by their own rigidity. Mrs. Rowe's expression had shifted from disapproval to something that looked uncomfortably like realization. She was watching Clara interact with confidence and genuine warmth, seeing perhaps that the woman her son had abandoned had found something far more valuable than the marriage he had offered. Nathan himself looked diminished somehow, smaller than Clara remembered. When their eyes met across the crowd, Clara felt nothing. Not anger, not hurt, not even satisfaction at his obvious discomfort. Just indifference and the quiet knowledge that she had moved beyond what they might have been. Later, as the event began to wind down and guests started departing, Clara found a moment alone in the garden. The same garden where Nathan had made his hollow proposal weeks ago. She stood by the fountain, breathing in the cool autumn air and letting the success of the afternoon settle into her bones. "You were magnificent," Julian said, appearing beside her as he so often did, with perfect timing. "I have never seen someone command a crowd so effectively while remaining so genuinely humble." Clara turned to him with a smile. "I was terrified." "I know," he said, "but you did it anyway." That is what courage is, Clara. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last sunlight filter through the trees. Clara thought about how far she had come from that awful morning at the church, how the woman she was now would barely recognize the woman she had been. "Julian," she said quietly, using his given name without thinking. "Thank you for all of this, for seeing something in me worth believing in when I could not see it myself." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious but warm. "I did not create your strength, Clara. I simply provided space for it to emerge. Everything you have accomplished here, you did through your own merit and determination. Still," she insisted, "you gave me a chance when no one else would. That matters." Julian reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished, and took her hand in his. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, sending warmth up her arm. "I have grown to care for you very deeply," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Not out of pity or obligation, but because I have seen who you truly are when freed from the constraints of others' expectations. You are brilliant and kind, strong and compassionate. You challenge me to be better, to see beyond my own limited perspective." Clara's heart raced. "Julian, I'm not asking for an answer now," he interrupted gently. "I know you are still healing, still discovering who you are beyond the role you were raised to fill. But I want you to know that I am here, not as your employer or your benefactor, but as a man who has fallen in love with a woman standing before me." The words hung in the air between them, precious and terrifying. Clara had been so focused on rebuilding her independence, on proving she did not need to be saved, that she hadn't allowed herself to examine the growing feelings she had for Julian. But they were there, undeniable and strong, built on weeks of working side by side, of conversations that ranged from practical to philosophical, of watching him treat every person he encountered with dignity and respect. "I'm not the same woman who stood at that altar," Claire said carefully. "I do not know if I am ready for promises or commitments. I'm still learning how to trust my own judgment." "I know," Julian said, squeezing her hand, "and I am not asking you to be ready. I am simply telling you how I feel, and letting you know that whenever you are ready, if you are ever ready, I will be here." Before Clara could respond, voices approached from the main house. Julian released her hand reluctantly, stepping back to a more appropriate distance as a group of departing guests came to offer their final thanks. The moment was broken, but something fundamental had been acknowledged. As Clara accepted compliments and said her goodbyes, she felt Julian's presence beside her like an anchor, steady and sure. When she finally left Evermere that evening, riding home in the gathering dusk, her mind was full of possibilities she had never imagined on that morning when Nathan had walked away. Perhaps, she thought, being left at the altar had not been the end of her story after all. Perhaps it had been only the beginning. 5. Winter arrived early that year, bringing frost that etched delicate patterns on windows and turned the Evermere Gardens into a landscape of crystalline beauty. Clara had continued her work at the estate through the changing seasons, watching the school flourish under the new system she had implemented. The children were thriving, the families were engaged, and even the most skeptical members of the community had come to respect her competence and dedication. But something else had changed too, something deeper and more personal. The connection between Clara and Julian had grown stronger with each passing week, built on shared work and honest conversation. They had fallen into a pattern of taking walks through the estate after their afternoon meetings, discussing everything from village politics to philosophy to their own histories and hopes. Julian had told her about his previous engagement, a match arranged by his parents to a woman who had ultimately chosen a wealthier title over him. He described the humiliation not of the rejection itself, but of realizing he had been valued only for his position, not for who he was as a person. Clara had shared her own history in return, not just the dramatic abandonment at the church, but the years leading up to it. The pressure to make an advantageous match. The slow erosion of her own desires beneath the weight of everyone else's expectations. The realization that she had agreed to marry Nathan not because she loved him, but because he represented security and approval. "I think part of me knew," Clara admitted one afternoon as they walked along the frozen pond at the edge of the estate. "Even before the wedding, I would watch Nathan sometimes and feel nothing, no excitement or anticipation, just relief that I had done what everyone wanted me to do. And now?" Julian asked, his breath visible in the cold air. "Now I feel everything," Clara said, stopping to face him. The winter sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. "Sometimes it is overwhelming, learning to trust my own feelings again, learning to believe that what I want matters as much as what others expect." Julian reached out to touch her face, his gloved hand gentle against her cheek. "What you want matters most of all, Clara. Never doubt that." They had grown comfortable with small touches over the weeks, hands brushing as they worked, arms linked during walks, moments of connection that felt natural and right. But they had not spoken again of Julian's declaration of love, both understanding that Clara needed time and space to discover her own heart without pressure. Now, standing in the winter afternoon with his hand warm against her face, Clara felt a certainty settle into her bones. She was ready. Not because she needed to be saved or because society expected it, but because she had chosen him, with clear eyes and an open heart. "The spring charity event is coming," Julian said, his voice carefully neutral. "It will be even larger than the autumn gathering. More donors, more scrutiny, more opportunities for gossip and speculation." Clara understood what he was not quite asking. Her presence at Evermere was already the subject of endless speculation in town. Some had accepted the truth of her employment and moved on. Others continued to believe there must be something scandalous beneath the surface. A woman working so closely with an unmarried duke, spending so many hours at his estate, surely there had to be more to the story. "Let them speculate," Clara said firmly. "I have done nothing wrong, and neither have you. I will not hide or alter my behavior to satisfy people who are determined to think poorly of me regardless." "You are remarkable," Julian said softly. "Did you know that? Truly remarkable." "I am learning to believe it," Clara admitted. "Slowly, but I am learning." They continued their walk in comfortable silence, returning to the main house as dusk began to fall. But before they went inside, Julian stopped her with a hand on her arm. Clara, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know there is no wrong answer. I will respect whatever you decide. Her heart began to race, sensing the importance of what was coming. The spring event will bring everyone together again, Julian continued. All the same people who were at your wedding, who witnessed what Nathan did, who have spent months discussing your presence here. They will come with expectations and judgments already formed. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I could face them alone, as I always have. Or we could face them together, not as employer and employee, but as partners making a choice about our future. I am asking Clara Trent if you would consider marrying me. Not because you need protection or security, but because we have built something real together, something worth declaring before the world. Clara's breath caught. The proposal was so like Julian, direct, honest, free of manipulation or pressure. He was not trying to save her or fix her situation. He was simply offering a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. I love you, she said, the words coming easily now that she had given herself permission to feel them. I love your integrity and your kindness. I love how you see people, really see them, beyond their positions or appearances. I love working beside you, building something meaningful together. Julian's eyes shone with hope, but he held himself still, waiting for her complete answer. When Nathan left me at that altar, Clara continued, I thought my life was ending. I thought I would never recover from the shame and humiliation. But you showed me that what ended was not my life, but my willingness to be less than I am to make others comfortable. She stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. I do not want to marry you because society expects it or because it would silence gossip. I want to marry you because you have become my dearest friend and my greatest ally. Because when I imagine my future, I see you in it, not as a rescuer but as a partner. Is that a yes? Julian asked, a smile beginning to break across his face. Yes, Clara said, laughing as tears of joy sprang to her eyes. Yes, I will marry you, Julian Ashbourne. Not because I need to, but because I want to. He pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her and holding her as if she were something precious and irreplaceable. When he kissed her, it was gentle and reverent, full of promise for a future they would build together. The announcement of their engagement was met with exactly the response Clara had anticipated. Shock, speculation, and no small amount of gossip. Some claimed she had planned it all along, that she had deliberately caused the broken engagement with Nathan to pursue a duke. Others suggested Julian was simply being kind to a damaged woman, that the marriage was more charity than romance. Clara found she did not care. Let them talk. Let them invent whatever stories made them feel superior or entertained. She knew the truth of what she and Julian had built together, and that was all that mattered. The spring charity event became something more, an engagement celebration woven into the annual gathering. Clara helped plan every detail, determined that the focus would remain on the school and the community work rather than on her personal life. But Julian insisted on one public acknowledgement of their union. When the day arrived, the grounds of Evermere were transformed. Spring flowers bloomed in carefully tended beds, and the charity school had been decorated with work from the students. The attendance was even larger than the autumn event, with curiosity drawing people who had never shown interest in charitable work before. Clara wore a dress of pale green, elegant and appropriate without attempting to compete with the splendor of her surroundings. She greeted guests with Julian at her side, her hand resting comfortably on his arm, facing the same crowd who had watched her be abandoned months before. Nathan was not in attendance. Clara had heard through mutual acquaintances that he had become engaged to an heiress from London, a match that would restore his family's finances without the complications of a jilted bride. She wished him well, with genuine sincerity, grateful that his cowardice had freed her to find something far better. The presentations went smoothly, with even more impressive results to share than the previous autumn. Enrollment had increased, attendance remained high, and several tenant families had specifically requested to speak about how Clara's interventions had changed their children's lives. When it came time for the engagement announcement, Julian kept it simple. He thanked everyone for their support of Evermere's charitable programs, then turned to Clara with unmistakable warmth. Many of you know that Miss Trent came to Evermere during a difficult time in her life, he said, his voice carrying across the assembled guests. What you may not know is that she has transformed not only the operations of our school and village programs, but has also transformed my understanding of what partnership truly means. He took Clara's hand, facing her rather than the crowd. Clara has shown me that true strength lies not in avoiding hardship, but in choosing to grow from it. She has taught me that vulnerability and courage can coexist, that asking for help does not diminish one's worth, and that the most meaningful relationships are built on honesty and mutual respect. Turning back to the guests, he made the formal announcement. It is my honor and privilege to tell you that Miss Trent has agreed to become my wife. Not because circumstances force this choice, but because we have chosen each other freely, with clear hearts and open eyes. The applause that followed was genuine, at least for most of the assembled crowd. Clara saw tears in her mother's eyes, pride on her father's face. She saw the tenant families cheering, children clapping enthusiastically. She even saw some of the more judgmental members of society offering reluctant approval, unable to deny the obvious affection between the engaged couple. As the celebration continued into evening, Clara found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her here. Being left at the altar had felt like the worst thing that could possibly happen, a public humiliation that would define the rest of her life. Instead, it had become the catalyst for discovering who she truly was beneath the expectations and obligations she had carried for so long. "Do you have any regrets?" Julian asked later, when they had stolen a moment alone in the garden that had witnessed so many turning points in their relationship. Clara considered the question seriously, as she always did. "I regret the pain Nathan caused and the gossip that hurt my family. But I cannot regret where that pain led me. I have found meaningful work, genuine friendship, and love built on truth rather than convenience." She leaned into Julian's embrace, feeling safe and valued in a way she had never experienced before. "If I had married Nathan, I would have spent my life being less than I am, making myself small to fit into the role of Duchess. With you, I get to be fully myself, flaws and strengths and all. You are perfect exactly as you are," Julian said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." The wedding took place in early summer at the small church on the Evermere estate, a far cry from the grand spectacle that had been planned for Clara's marriage to Nathan. Instead of 200 guests filling enormous pews, there were perhaps 40 people who genuinely cared about the couple's happiness. Tenant families sat beside members of the gentry. Children scattered flowers along the aisle, and the atmosphere was one of celebration rather than social performance. Clara wore a simple gown of ivory silk, elegant without being ostentatious. Her father walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, whispering that he was proud of her strength and grateful she had found a man who deserved her. When Clara reached the altar and placed her hand in Julian's, she felt none of the anxiety or doubt that had plagued her before. This was right. This was where she was meant to be, not because society dictated it or because she had no other options, but because she had chosen it freely. The vows were traditional, but felt newly meaningful when spoken with genuine intention. When Julian promised to love and cherish her in sickness and health, Clara heard the deeper promise beneath. To see her truly, to value her completely, to walk beside her as an equal partner. When she made her own vows, she met Julian's eyes and spoke from her heart. "I promise to build a life with you based on honesty and respect. To challenge you when you need challenging and support you when you need support. To be your partner in all things, working together to create something meaningful and lasting." The kiss that sealed their marriage was met with genuine joy from the assembled witnesses. As Clara and Julian walked back down the aisle together, Clara caught sight of her own reflection in a window. The woman looking back at her was confident and strong, whole and complete in herself, choosing to share her life rather than seeking someone to complete it. The celebration afterward was held on the Evermere grounds, with music and dancing and food share between all classes without rigid social divisions. Clara danced with her husband, with her father, with Julian's steward and the schoolmaster, and several of the tenant farmers who had never imagined dancing with the Duchess. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Clara stood with Julian overlooking the estate that had become her home. The charity school was visible in the distance, children's laughter still echoing from the last of the day's games. The village where she had worked so hard to build trust and connection sprawled below them. "I've been thinking," Julian said, his arm warm around her waist, "about expanding the school programs. Perhaps offering evening classes for adults who never learned to read or apprenticeships for older children interested in trades." Clara smiled, her mind already working through the logistics. "We would need to reorganize the schedule and find qualified teachers. But yes, I think it is an excellent idea. Let me draw up some proposals." "I love that about you," Julian said, turning her to face him. "That your first instinct is not to delegate or dismiss, but to engage. To take an idea and make it reality through your own effort and intelligence." "We make a good team," Clara said simply. "Both of us working towards something larger than ourselves." As darkness fell and the celebration began to wind down, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been left at the altar by a man who never truly saw her, humiliated in front of everyone she knew, facing an uncertain future with a damaged reputation and no clear path forward. But from that disaster had come discovery of her own strength, her own worth, her own capacity to choose a life of meaning rather than settling for security and approval. The Duke who had stepped forward from the crowd that awful morning had not saved her. Instead, he had offered her the space and support to save herself, and in doing so, had become the partner she had never known to hope for. Clara had been left at the altar, and it had been the best thing that ever happened to her. Not because it was easy or painless, but because it had forced her to become the woman she was always meant to be. A woman who knew her own worth, who chose her own path, who built her own future brick by brick through determination and hard work. And now, standing beside the man she loved with her whole heart, looking out at the life they would build together, Clara felt complete. Not because marriage completed her, but because she had completed herself first, and then chosen to share that wholeness with someone who valued it completely. The gossips would probably never stop talking entirely. There would always be people who insisted she had planned her escape from Nathan, who whispered that she had married above her station, who found scandal where there was only honest affection and hard-earned respect. But Clara had learned that their opinions held power only if she gave it to them. She had learned that reputation could be rebuilt through action rather than defended through argument. She had learned that the only judgment that mattered was her own, and she could look at her reflection now without shame or doubt. She had been left at the altar. The Duke had stepped from the crowd, and together, they had created something far more valuable than the fairy tale ending society had tried to write for them. They had created a real partnership, built on truth and respect, dedicated to making their corner of the world better through practical work and genuine care. As Julian led her back toward the house where their new life together would begin, Clara looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She thought about the woman she had been on that awful morning, standing frozen in her wedding dress while the man she was supposed to marry walked away. If she could speak to that woman now, she would tell her that the humiliation would pass, that the pain would fade, and that on the other side of disaster lay possibility. She would tell her to be brave, to trust her own strength, and to believe that the end of one story could become the beginning of something far better. But mostly, she would tell her to hold on, because the Duke who stepped from the crowd was not coming to save her. He was coming to walk beside her while she saved herself, and that would make all the difference. Dear listener, as we conclude Clara's journey, may you carry with you the truth her story reveals, that our greatest disasters often contain the seeds of our greatest transformations. Like Clara, you may have faced moments when the future you planned crumbled before your eyes, when public humiliation or private disappointment left you questioning everything you believed about yourself. But also like Clara, you possess within you the strength to rebuild, the courage to choose differently, and the wisdom to recognize that being saved and saving yourself are not the same thing. True partnership does not rescue us from our challenges, but walks beside us as we face them. As you rest tonight, let go of the judgments others have placed upon you. Release the need to be perfect or proper, or palatable to those who cannot see your worth. Know that your value is inherent, not earned, and that the right people will recognize it without your needing to prove it. May your sleep be deep and restorative, and may you wake with Clara's quiet certainty that you are the author of your own story, and that the best chapters may still be unwritten. With deep gratitude for sharing this journey, from all of us at Legends of the Fall, thank you for listening, and may you find your own happy ending, built not on rescue, but on choice.